Welcome to the latest episode of our podcast series for financial advisors. Today's episode is Build, Grow, and Transact, from Breakaway to Transaction in 3 years. It's a conversation with Patrick Larkin, partner and practice leader at Cerity Partners. I'm Louis Diamond, and this is the Diamond Podcast for financial advisors.
At Diamond Consultants, we help elite advisors identify the right environment for their businesses to thrive, whether that's at a wirehouse, boutique, or independent firm. With nearly 3 decades of experience, we've guided thousands of advisors and represented more than $250 billion in assets transitioned. And each year, 1 in 4 advisors managing $1 billion or more who change firms are our clients. Our process is education-driven and based on building relationships, starting as your strategic partner well before you're even thinking of a move. To schedule a confidential conversation, call us at 908-879-1002. Wondering why advisors change firms and where they're headed? Are transition deals going up or down? Those very questions and more inspired us to create our annual Advisor Transition Report. It's the award-winning, data-driven resource designed for advisors that connects the dots between the motivations around movement and the firm's appetite for top talent. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need to make smart decisions. Download your copy at diamond-consultants.com/transition report.
Ownership as a way of creating opportunities you can't always predict. That's exactly why we created our Build, Grow, and Transact series. Independence isn't the end of the story. It's often the beginning of thinking differently about enterprise value, optionality, and what comes next. Today's guest is Patrick Larkin, partner and practice leader at Cerity Partners, and formerly the founder of Oak Hill Wealth Advisors. Patrick spent nearly 15 years building a successful practice at A.G. Edwards, Wachovia, and eventually Wells Fargo, before launching his own independent firm in 2022. Just 3 years later, he merged that firm into Cerity. At first glance, that timeline might seem surprisingly short, but as you'll hear, the merger wasn't a change in direction. It was the result of seeing his business differently once he owned it. Yet, it's this perspective that really brings that thought home. Patrick said the day Oak Hill launched felt like the business had gone public, because overnight, what had been viewed as a book of business became an enterprise with substantially greater value, some 4 to 5 times the value of what it was worth at Wells. And that realization changed the way he invested, the way he hired, and ultimately, the way he thought about the future. Pat and I also talk about something advisors don't often discuss candidly: what life actually looks like after a merger. How much control do you give up? What changes day to day? How do you know whether you're joining a partner or simply selling a business? Whether your long-term plan is to remain independent forever or eventually join a larger organization, Patrick's experience is a reminder that ownership isn't simply about control. It's about creating optionality and putting yourself in a position where the next decision is yours to make. So let's get to it. Patrick, thanks for coming on our show today.
My pleasure. Nice to meet you, Louis.
You too. So let's start off basically how we start every interview. Tell us about yourself, your background, and how you found your way into our industry in the first place.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I knew I always wanted to be a financial advisor. That part really wasn't in question. But upon graduating college and being a 22-year-old, I knew that it was probably not practical to walk in and start advising people my parents' age with their life savings. Probably wasn't going to be a recipe for success. So I took a quick tour through the pharmaceutical industry first, which ended up being unexpectedly valuable. My employers there pushed me to think like an entrepreneur and within our territories. And honestly, that mindset never left me. It shaped how I built everything that came after. Eventually, an opportunity presented itself in Loudoun County, Virginia, in Northern Virginia, and I became an FA trainee with A.G. Edwards. Absolutely fantastic firm to start my career. Now, what drew me to this career was pretty simple. I felt like it was one of the professions that we had an opportunity to do so much good for others while simultaneously also doing well for yourself. And those two things aren't in conflict. I also really love the idea that in this profession, there was no hiding. You don't get paid to show up. You get paid for what you actually do. And perhaps for me, what was most important, I loved the weight of responsibility. I loved earning people's trust. I loved the idea of being deserving of their trust and being a steward of what they've worked a lifetime to build. I never took that lightly, and I still don't.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, the number of people I've heard who talked so fondly about AG Edwards, and there's a bunch of other firms that have since been absorbed or merged that are like the regional firms of old. So I'm not surprised to hear you loved it. But AG Edwards obviously became Wells Fargo Advisors or was acquired or merged with Wells Fargo. So I know you're at Wells and AG Edwards until 2022. So give us a quick version. How do you build your practice from the pharma world into being an RPA?
Yeah, so as I started with AG Edwards, I came in at really just the perfect time. It was towards the end of the financial crisis. And I built the business the old-fashioned way with a lot of cold calling and eventually did some dinner seminars, which I can tell you is a very expensive way to learn how to speak in front of a room. But I made some progress. And I was also in a great office, small enough that some of the advisors there would hand off some of the smaller accounts that they weren't interested in working with, and got an opportunity to get a lot of reps in working with real life clients and individuals. I knew early on I didn't have enough talent to win on talent alone. So I made up for it and compensated for that with really hard work. The real turning point came for me when AG Edwards was first acquired by Wachovia Securities. And that was about 5 years into my career. And at that point, my branch manager, who was eyeing retirement, asked me to step in as her partner. And that changed everything. We eventually moved over to a Wachovia Securities office, another really great local office in Loudoun County, Virginia. And from that office, I worked on and became a SEMA, a CFP, worked with the clients, built a business through referrals. And I found at that point in my career, when I would go to a meeting with Wachovia, eventually Wells Fargo, as a young 30-year-old, I would look around the room often and realize that I was the youngest person in the room. The funny thing was 10 years later, I would go into that same room and I'd look around and I still was the youngest guy in that room. And those demographics in our industry and when I came into our industry ultimately led that office that I worked in and with Wells Fargo Advisors. I eventually was the recipient and party to 5 different succession plans at
Wow.
Wells Fargo Advisors. I hoped that I had built a reputation as somebody that these other advisors would entrust with their clients. And over that time period, really, I would say professionally, one of my accomplishments I'm most proud of is all 5 of those retired advisors that I used to work with who had an opportunity to see me work with clients, all became clients of mine. I still continue to work with, and it's professionally just one of the greatest honors that I've ever had.
I mean, that's a large number of
Yeah.
advisors you helped
Yeah.
sunset, but I would agree. It's the ultimate proof of concept that they not only trusted you with their clients and their life's work, but now also with their family as well. So I like that. The kind of the full life cycle there. So I'm curious though, you stayed at Wells through a
Yeah.
very turbulent time, through the fake account scandal. There's a lot of attrition. I mean, obviously they're still a powerhouse to this day, but what kept you at Wells for as long as it did before you left in 2022?
You described it as a turbulent time. Pretty turbulent might be an understatement. Even before Wells, the transition to Wells, Wachovia Bank had been the first company that we transitioned to from AG Edwards. And we, of course, went through the financial crisis during that time period, and hand-holding our clients and helping them get through that time period and dealing with concerns that we shouldn't really have to be prepared with is my money safe? It's not
Yeah.
what's happening to the market, but is my money safe in your institution? But once things stabilized, I found real purpose in partnering with some of the retiring advisors and opportunities that came up. It was a really wonderful climate and atmosphere in our local office. It was really a family like atmosphere. And I still had a lot to learn. And all those advisors that I partnered with, I've joked I've never had an original idea in my entire life. I stole all my good ideas from them. And some of them were really ahead of their time, and I learned, adopted, and built my own philosophies by working closely with them. Ultimately, by the time I left Wells Fargo, I was finishing up the fifth sunset program and had only made my way halfway through the sunset before the opportunity presented itself to create my own practice.
So I'm curious, when did you first seriously start thinking about leaving and what really tipped the scales for you? What was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back?
Yeah, it really was a number of small items and ultimately one big one. But for a long time, I'd been content. But as I tried to grow the business beyond what I could do individually, I felt like I kept running into walls. There were felt like limitations on how I could build out my team and structure the practice the way I envisioned it. Additionally, there were some new policies that also started to bother me. One of them was the platform advisory fee, which in my eyes was less about client transparency and more about replacing a declining revenue source on the firm's balance sheet. And after dealing with clients and helping them through the bank scandal at the firm, I was concerned that this would come back and hurt me and the relationships that I have with my clients. Incidentally, I just recently onboarded
Oh,
a new client that transferred to us. And for them, looking at their statement, identifying this platform advisory fee
oh boy.
was the last straw for them before they moved about 15 million of assets to us. Also, I thought I would be a better allocator of resources than Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo retained about half of the revenue that I earned for the business. They seemed to think that the best allocation of that money was additional middle management, whereas I thought investment in technology, investment in additional personnel, and an investment in marketing were best places to continue to build out my vision. The final straw, and really the thing that crystallized everything for me, was when I read a book in 2021 called The Infinite Game, a
Mm.
book written by Simon Sinek. Chapter 8, the title is Ethical Fading, and it uses the Wells Fargo bank scandal as a case study in what happens when a firm loses its moral compass. I read the chapter and thought, there it is. I have to do something. That was really the final push I needed. I mentioned earlier, I was very fortunate to start my career with a company called AG Edwards, a regional brokerage firm. And while I was at AG Edwards, there was a research report that came out on AG Edwards as a company. And I'm going to paraphrase a little bit on what was said in that report. But ultimately, there was a line in there, and it was a criticism, but I took it as a huge positive as being an employee there. The line said, while management does not necessarily say it, we believe the client is put ahead of the shareholder. And that was something I was very proud of. And I just, upon reflecting on it, felt confident those were words that I never was going to see go to print about Wells Fargo.
So you left Wells in 2022 and founded Oak Hill Wealth Partners in Lansdowne, Virginia. Walk us through that decision. Why go independent rather than going to another firm?
I really thought moving to another firm, the things that I'd grown frustrated with at Wells Fargo Advisors, I would also find at another wirehouse firm. I was ready. And honestly, the simple answer is I thought I could do better. And I wanted control after having what I felt like was very little control. I had grown frustrated with others making important decisions, and I wanted an opportunity to grab the reins and make decisions on my own. I believe at that time, the future of wealth management was going to be built around fiduciary advice. And I didn't want to watch that from the sidelines anymore. I was watching what was happening in industry. And as we were trying to hire new advisors, reaching out to college graduates who were studying CFP programs, identified that they were more inclined to want to start employment with an RIA than a wirehouse. What made the timing work really well was Wells Fargo had actually introduced a program to help advisors in the private client group spin off and establish their own RIAs. Now, whenever I tell this to another advisor, particularly ones that at wirehouses, they can't understand it. And quite frankly, I don't understand why they helped us do it. But we were about the 30th practice that they helped us through this process, and they provided real support. They hired consultants, made vendor recommendations, even referrals to financing so I could pay off my last succession plan before I left. The only really upside for Wells Fargo was that the ask was that we continue to use First Clearing as the custodian. And one of the downsides for me was I was going to leave all my deferred comp behind with Wells Fargo. Now, all clients had to do to join me was sign a positive consent. And on May 9th, 2020, we turned on our computers in our new office and our clients were already there. That same day, we launched and started a relationship with Charles Schwab. And it was so exciting to be able to start shopping for what I thought was the best fintech, really feeling like I was stuck with proprietary tools that Wells Fargo advisors had offered. I felt like I was a kid in a candy store. And if there was a cool tool that I identified that would help us serve our clients better, I was all in and I was buying it. I really feel that some of the technology that Oak Hill eventually bought into and some of the tools we're using now are going to take years and years before they eventually trickle down to where the wirehouses are, if ever.
Interesting. So it was for the most part a internal move from
It
one
was
channel to the other.
It was an internal move, but there was no requirement to stay at First Clearing. As a fiduciary, they couldn't make those demands. And again, they helped us with the financing, which is really unusual that they helped us secure a loan so I could pay off the last retiring advisor. It's really unusual that a bank will loan money where there is no business at the time. But because of previous experience that financial institution had working with Wells, they helped us facilitate the transaction. And the program is still in place at Wells Fargo, which is absolutely amazing to me after the experience that I've just had myself.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, does it cannibalize like a more profitable revenue source? Sure. But if the alternative was all the assets go to Schwab or Fidelity, to me, honestly, it's smart. I think they play the long game by not being adversarial on it.
I think they played a long game and they took the philosophy, and I think they use it as a recruiting tool that if you love them, set them free. And that's exactly what they did.
So the rest of the episode, I want to talk about your eventual and not that long period of time transaction or decision to merge Oak Hill with Cerity Partners. This is our Build, Grow, Transact sub-series. And I was really struck by your story because you were 3 years or so into running Oak Hill, and then your merger with Cerity Partners, an amazing RIA, closed. That's a fairly short runway. Usually when I see folks go independent for the first time, it's 10, 15, 20 years, maybe never, that they decide to merge or sell. I'm curious to understand your thinking about the transaction. Were you looking to do something, or was it just like right place, right time, and the opportunity presented itself?
I had started Oak Hill with the intent of eventually down the road, much closer to retirement, looking for a partner. The opportunity and what I learned early on helped change that idea and philosophy. And I adapted and made modifications to take advantage of it.
Interesting. So you weren't necessarily planning on selling or merging the business. It just kind of circumstances happened the way they did.
Yeah, when we started Oak Hill Wealth Advisors, it was really pretty short period of time before we started getting calls from larger national RIAs about a potential acquisition. Much sooner than I expected. Early on, I just brushed them off, but about a year in, I took one of those calls. And it really just opened my eyes up. I realized for the first time this little firm, this little practice actually had some real value, way more than I'd given it credit for. That first call, that first exploration didn't go anywhere. It wasn't a good fit. But what it gave me was a much clearer picture of what the serious acquirers were actually looking for. And that changed decisions I made at Oak Hill going forward. I really, at that point, stopped trying to optimize for near term profit and really thought of my business as a business and started building towards enterprise value, sometimes at the cost of short term income. And that turned out to be exactly the right call.
It's such an interesting perspective. Let's double click into that concept. So it sounds almost counterintuitive that if you kind of had this light bulb moment that like, okay, maybe I want to transact my business sooner than I initially thought. I think most people would say, let's become lean and mean. Let's become as profitable as possible so my EBITDA is higher. But you took the different approach. What were the decisions you did to invest more in enterprise value rather than current cash flow?
A true business is one that doesn't need me to be here every day to operate. And when we left Wells Fargo Advisors, it was myself and one other advisor that created Oak Hill Wealth Advisors. I was responsible for about 95% of the assets and revenue. And one of the more significant investments we made is in additional advisors. I recruited 3 new advisors, all CFPs, to join Oak Hill Wealth Advisors, whereas before I had been largely managing all the relationships myself. For someone that kind of grew up in the regional and wirehouse space, it's pretty counterintuitive to start moving relationships away from you onto other advisors. You're trained and built to create a moat around your relationships, and realized that the potential acquirers are not interested, at least the ones I was interested in, weren't interested in buying a book. They were interested in buying a business. And that just meant every decision we made going forward was not profit driven, but how can I increase the value of the business? So after that first call, I knew I probably would be looking to move forward with a transaction sooner as opposed to the end of retirement. That information that I got on that first call helped me realize that when Oak Hill Wealth Advisors opened its doors on May 9th, 2022, we effectively had an IPO. I had great familiarity with how the succession plans at Wells Fargo Advisors worked. And on that day that we opened our practice, the value of my business jumped to be 4 to 5 times the value of it in a succession plan at Wells Fargo Advisors. Now, I knew going forward that I was going to be able to increase revenue. I was going to be able to increase EBITDA. I was going to potentially have some benefits from a market tailwind. I knew the multiples of EBITDA that the firms use may fluctuate, but the biggest change by far occurred leaving the wirehouse and having the value of my business grow 4 to 5 fold in that same day. So what I really focused on was making sure that I was going to, when I was ready to start looking again, after I had worked on improving the practice, really was going to look for a firm that was going to be a good cultural fit for both my clients, my team, and myself.
It's such a cool perspective. I've never heard anyone say that the day we launched your independent business was like an IPO, but it honestly, it's so true. You're planting a flag in the ground that like, here is real value. This is value that we've created that we own rather than it being a book of business and a W-2 paycheck. And it's a fascinating perspective.
Yeah, it really is amazing that the value changed that much on one day and the future value changes. Looking at the equity that I owned in Oak Hill Wealth Advisors, it made sense to consider, is there a better way to take some risk off the table for myself and my family and diversify some of the equity that I had in Oak Hill Wealth Advisors with a larger enterprise?
Makes complete sense. Obviously, everyone would sign up for 4 to 5x increase in
Sure.
value. That's not the reason most people go independent, but it's important to know. So, and also what I really liked about what you shared is I think a really valuable learning for anyone is like those calls come in, whether it's from annoying people like me or from an acquirer or from a firm, like they're not all noise. Like you took it as an opportunity to learn. Like even though that first person who called wasn't the right fit, it crystallized something in your mind and it let you make proactive decisions that
Right.
ultimately paid off in spades when it came time to sign the dotted line for your transaction with Cerity. So I think it's brilliant. And it's very like big picture, big business owner type stuff that I think a lot of people would just filter out because it's annoying and I'm young, I'm not looking to sell.
Yeah, that first call changed my opinion about timing of when to move forward with a partnership. Originally, I thought this would be something at the end of retirement. The timing of doing so sooner seemed a lot more appealing after having that conversation and realizing what we had actually built.
Amazing. So ultimately, you decided to merge with Cerity Partners. We've had Kurt Mazinski from Cerity Partners on the show. They're a real heavyweight within the RIA world. Most recently, they were valued at $8 billion dollars in a recap, and it's a very impressive firm. What specifically drew you to Cerity versus other potential buyers? Like you said, you got a lot of calls.
After that first call, just got to work and focused on continuing to take care of our clients, building a team, adding new advisors, being a mentor to those advisors. But at the same time, we were being approached fairly regularly by that point. And I had a pretty good system for quickly deciding whether something was worth a second look, and most weren't. But about a year ago, and one of the national RIAs caught my attention, and I started having conversations with them. And once I had progressed with them, I thought, you know what, if I'm giving this consideration, I really need to cast a wider net. So I reached out to other RIAs that I had looked at and admired and been keeping an eye on. And ultimately, my longtime business coach, Barbara Kay, suggested I talk with Cerity Partners, a company that one of her other clients had just recently joined. And from the very first call, I could tell something was different. And I talked to many different companies. Cerity Partners and an individual I spoke with, Jeff Newman, they weren't leading with valuation formulas or deal structure. They were asking questions about my clients, my team, and how I actually ran the practice. They had a very defined process for identifying partners who were genuinely compatible, not just advisors with books that were transferable. And that distinction mattered greatly to me. They also offered really, in my opinion, the right balance of support and still having some autonomy, and their aspiration to deliver consistent standard of care to clients, whether they be in California or Virginia, so that those individuals get the same quality of experience, resonated with how I was already running things within my practice. That combination of support and autonomy, I really like the idea of continuing to have oversight over my local practice, over our practice, which included the budget, salaries, and bonuses. It more than anybody else felt like a partnership and not a buyout. And I really appreciated during that first call, Cerity was the only company that talked about a 100-year plan. It was amazing to me to hear what their thoughts were. Most of the other firms I spoke with talked about valuations, and very quickly in the process, I found myself on a Zoom call with a Patagonia fleece vest wearing private equity rep walking me through a valuation. And it was efficient, but it was not a cultural fit for
Yeah.
me. And the infrastructure behind us and the combination of autonomy is really harder to find than most people think. As I progressed with Cerity, I remember early on in the process thinking to myself, my God, I hope they want me. I hope they want me, because I could tell I'm a very process driven person. They had a process with the way they brought me on board. And ultimately, we had a due diligence trip set up to go to one of their larger offices where I met with one of their leaders, Claire O'Keefe, part of their practice development, and had an opportunity to meet with different leaders within the firm and really get my arms wrapped around the potential that they had. Just the quality of the people I encountered through the whole process just kept reinforcing the decision. And by the time we got to the finish line, it didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like I was joining something that I was excited to be part of. So just a little bit more about what attracted me to Cerity. Their culture is just phenomenal. Cerity Partners uses the word meritocracy, and they actually mean it. Ownership and influence here track your contribution, not your tenure or how well you play the politics. I just attended my first partner meeting in April, and without exaggeration, it was the most extraordinary professional meeting I've attended in my 25-year career. During the meeting, there was open debate about the direction of the firm, and every voice in the room carried weight. You could feel the culture, and it's not that type of culture is built over years. You can't fake it. Everyone in the room, it felt like, was rowing in the same direction. And by the time the meeting was over, I was so excited to get back to my team and tell them about what I had just witnessed. I wasn't looking for the exit. I was looking for the brick wall to run through. I was so excited. And every once in a while, I wonder, having spent so much time in the wirehouse space, is the bar just set really low for me when I talk to some of my other colleagues that have been independent for a long time. But it was just an absolutely amazing experience. And I do want to just add, one of the last really important things to me about Cerity Partners is I've been very fortunate with my career and in this profession. And part of my goal over the rest of my career is to have a legacy. And my legacy currently exists with the families I've advised and the team that I've built and have served and led. But Cerity Partners is helping me achieve even a greater legacy in our industry with our shared long-term goals. During my first meeting, they talked about their 100-year vision of being a worldwide employee-owned professional services firm. And currently, and this is very exciting, the employees are the largest shareholder of the firm. No one else I talked to talked about their long-term goals like this. And it's a vision I believe in. I want to contribute to help to see it accomplished. And one day when I do retire, I want to look back and see how I contributed to a company that I believe is going to change the direction of professional wealth management.
Wow.
My partnership with Cerity Partners is going to make that a reality. It's just an amazing place. Yeah, very happy.
Honestly, you can't fake that type of enthusiasm. It sounds like you entered into a transaction, it's like jumping into the deep end. How do you sort through what's the sales process versus what's real? How much of this is actually going to translate to my life? But hearing you not that long after the transaction, you still feel that is very cool. In the press release I read, you cited estate planning, private markets access, and cross-border planning as key reasons for the merger. Can you talk about what it was about those? Maybe anything else that was missed?
Yeah.
And were those not things that you felt like you could have delivered yourself as a standalone?
I thought that they were going to help me be able to be more effective in delivering those, but they weren't the complete picture. The capabilities that we cited in the release were genuine gaps I wanted to fill and have available for clients and be able to prospect and go after new additional clients. But being fully honest, there were also deeper drivers. One was my team. Sometimes we get emotional about this. Being someone who's trusted is really important to me, and that's something I hold in high priority. There are people that followed me out of Wells Fargo to join me. One of my client associates had delayed her retirement so that she could join me and help us launch for the first 3 months. One of my other client associates has been with me close to 15 years. These are people that trusted me to do the right thing and to make sure that I wasn't walking them off the plank. Being able to join Cerity Partners and give them a future that didn't hinge entirely on my personal longevity was a huge relief. And Cerity Partners is an ownership culture. I'm so happy to say today that every single individual on my team in our practice in Lansdowne is now either an equity owner in Cerity Partners or shortly, very shortly, will be an
Very cool.
equity owner. So they have a stake as well in what they're building. It matters. My youngest client associate noticed how much it costs to send to FedEx. And he goes, now that I'm an owner, maybe we should rethink about sending regular mail. Another driver was my family. And I've always had the philosophy of trying to prioritize and clients first, team and colleagues, and then my family. And I've always made decisions that if I put those others before myself, eventually I'll be taken care of. And going through this transaction, it was so generous to my family and provided such security. There was a little bit of guilt that am I doing this for all the right reasons? But being able to secure my family's future, converting equity in a 3-year-old RIA into a stake of an $8 billion plus valuation with institutional backing, that was a meaningful moment. And I'd be less than honest if I glossed over that. I also really wanted to be part of something larger than myself. And the opportunity to help build a legacy in this business with Cerity Partners really gives me the platform to do that.
Very cool. I can tell you're genuine, not just because of the way you sound, the way you're speaking, but in the very beginning of the episode, you talked about the reason you got into this business was because you thought it gave you like the dual purpose of being able to help people, but also being able to enrich yourself or your family. So this answer, it comes full circle. You're able to accomplish all these goals, which made it the right decision. And I think, look, I say to advisors all the time, you're allowed to be greedy, you're allowed to be selfish, as long as the clients are still in the front of your mind as the most important thing. There's nothing
Right.
wrong with
Yeah.
doing better for clients, building a legacy in your case, but also reaping the rewards of all your hard work and labor, and also all the risks that you've taken over your career. I got to ask you though, from being an employee of Wells, where you were running your team for the most part, you can run the business within their guardrails the way you want to then running an RIA, which is really like you're fully in control of everything, to now being a partner, but you're not the one who has the name on the door anymore.
Right. Right.
So how do you think about the giving up control and full ownership of your practice versus owning a very small amount of a much larger entity?
There was such continuity. Oak Hill Wealth Advisors and Cerity Partners were so philosophically aligned that I genuinely never felt like I was giving up anything that I wasn't glad to let go. My wife joined the business shortly before I left Wells Fargo Advisors. And still to this day, on my drive home from work, I call her up and say, you're not going to believe this. And it's all a positive, good thing. So Cerity has struck the perfect balance of that autonomy and support combination that I was looking for. So I still have control and a say over the way our practice is managed. Very shortly after the merger, my supervisor came down and met me for the first time, and we went out together after the day had ended. And early in the conversation, I said to him, what can I do to make your life easier? And he said, Pat, what can I do to make your life easier? And that set the tone that still exists to this day. I almost cried when he said that because that was so different than what I had experienced up to that point. So the collaboration, the way we work together, it's just absolutely amazing. And not once for a single moment have I second guessed my decision. And it's really weird because I've now been part of this organization for nearly 9 months, and there just has not been one thing that's occurred where I said, that's a disappointment. It's just been absolutely amazing every single day.
Very cool. To me, there's different arcs of like when you want to ask people the question of, hey, any regrets? And usually, like,
Right.
you don't want to ask them too soon because they're still going through the transition and integration
Right.
and growing pains. And you don't want to ask them too far in the future because you forget about what was life before. But like to be this short of a duration into this new partnership and to have these feelings, that's absolutely pretty special. I got two more questions for you, Pat, if you don't mind.
Sure.
First one, economically, to me, one of the hardest things for really any advisor to really grapple with or to fully comprehend or make their own is I own 100% of the equity in my business. I get to decide when I want to sell in the future. My business is growing 10% per year. If I wait to sell until 10 years from now, my business is going to be much bigger. And I get to keep all the cash flow. I get to make all the decisions. That compared to the path that you took, which was take cash off the table, which everyone understands, to now I own a much smaller piece of a much larger pie. How would you talk to someone about the financial trade-off between 100% ownership in their business, full control, full discretion over everything, versus becoming a minority equity partner in a larger entity?
You have to look at the valuation of my business. Again, the day that we opened our doors as Oak Hill Wealth Advisors, there was such a massive jump in the value of the business. There was not going to be an opportunity for an appreciation at that level. So then you have to compare what the growth rate is of Oak Hill Wealth Advisors versus a Cerity Partners. And I'm not embarrassed to say that Cerity Partners is and has been growing at a much faster rate of return. The value of the equity that I have retained in Cerity Partners, my ownership stake, I fully expect by the time I transact that business as I get closer to retirement, that's going to be worth many times more than whatever opportunity I would have had at Wells Fargo with the valuation they would have provided me. Never mind, very important, the tax consequences of a structure like this is all the retiring advisors that I worked with were taxed at their highest marginal rate. I owned a business and we were taxed at long-term capital
Yep.
gains rates. A significant difference in savings and what as the owner we actually realize. So yeah, I feel very comfortable with the ownership that I have and the control and continued opportunity with the meritocracy culture to increase my share of ownership in the company.
So, Pat, it's a really cool perspective. It's almost like do your homework. And if you find the right horse and the right jockey that can run faster than you can on your own, that the equity value will compound and grow and appreciate in a faster, more efficient way than what you're doing on your own, which makes complete sense. It's the ultimate trade off. And again, it's like jumping into the deep end. On the one hand, Oak Hill was all you, right? You control the growth for better or worse, for the
Mhm.
good days, the bad days, the good years, the bad years, versus now your growth is diversified amongst hundreds of partners across M&A, across different lead flow channels, et cetera. It makes complete sense. But honestly, if I were an advisor, I don't know how I would think about it. I think it's all just it is fact and circumstance based on where I am in my life and who the firm is and what I'm trying to accomplish. But it's such a cool perspective because usually the playbook that we see, which is why we did this series, is go independent and there's a long pause until there is a realization of all the value that's been created. So seeing you do this in a much quicker time frame, it seems like it was the absolute right decision. To me, it's just is another path, another way that an advisor or a firm is able to think about their future. Any final advice or parting words for someone who is sitting right where you are in 2021 or 2022, thinking about making the leap? And we'll say a transition in general, or really anything you want to share to wrap our episode here.
Thank you for having me. And this is a great question. Happy to give a thoughtful answer to it. Before I left Wells Fargo Advisors through the program and started Oak Hill Wealth Advisors, I had an opportunity to go through a due diligence process and make sure that this was going to be a right move for me. There was no carrot out there that was obvious. I learned after that first conversation that I had built a practice that had some value to it. I was leaving behind the security of something I knew, leaving behind a significant amount in deferred compensation, and I wanted to make sure I was making the right decision. And through that due diligence process, talked to about 5 other firms that had recently left Wells Fargo to join this RIA program. I asked them a lot of different questions about what their experience was. And at every point during those conversations, they all said the same thing at different points. And it sounded like this. They said, I'm working harder than I ever have before, but I wish I had done this sooner. So, my advice to those people, do it. I know that sounds simple, but I mean it. The fear of leaving is almost always worse than the actual experience of leaving. And I understand the inertia of not leaving and the real apprehension of what was on the other side. But what I found was a version of this profession I genuinely didn't know was possible. One where I could do things the right way on my terms for the people I care most about serving. And not every path is going to look like mine. Some advisors should go fully independent and stay there, and that can be an incredible life. But when it comes time to look for a partner, quite frankly, if Cerity Partners is not on your short list, you're making a significant mistake. And I say that not to sell anything, but because I've lived the comparison firsthand, and there's simply nothing else like it.
Pat, this has been really fun, but I don't think we've had anyone on the 8 years or so we've been doing this show that's gone through this type of arc or journey that you have. One of my big takeaways or sticking points that this episode brought for me is by going independent and taking control over your future, you created complete optionality for yourself to do exactly what you wanted to do with your business, even if that was different than what you initially planned. So in your case, it was selling within 3 years of going independent. But by taking action, being proactive, playing some offense, you made the opportunity happen on your terms and your timeline. So this has been fun in so many different ways. I loved your comment about how when you went independent, it's basically like the day of your IPO, the 4 to 5 times increase in value versus an internal succession deal. And even just the way to think about getting equity in a larger entity versus running your own plays only. So thank you so much for doing this. This has been fun.
As a financial advisor, you hold yourself to the highest standards of integrity, honesty, and credibility. You are successful because you take your professional responsibilities seriously and are dedicated to your clients. But are you living your best business life? Are your goals aligned with your firm's, or could a better option exist? Should I Stay or Should I Go is a book written with you in mind. It's a self-guided journey that walks you through the key steps that we take with our advisor clients. This strategic thought process and roadmap to professional self-discovery is designed to help you ask the right questions and think critically and objectively, whether you're considering change or not. Learn how to get your copy at diamond-consultants.com/thebook.